The wagon didn't stop. It slowed, lurched, and the teamster reached back with one boot and shoved, and then Thea was off the tailgate and into the air, and then she was in the snow, with the breath knocked clean out of her. She heard the chains rattle as the mules took the slack back up. She heard Vance click his tongue at them, that lazy sideways cluck men used on animals they didn't respect. And she heard the iron tires grind over the frozen ruts. And by the time she'd gotten her elbows under her and lifted her face out of the slush, the back of the freight wagon was already a small, dark shape. She wasn't worth the weight, sliding around the shoulder of the mountain. She was the arithmetic of it, plain as a column in a ledger. She'd paid him in St. Joseph a passage as far as the Sweetgrass crossing, and somewhere past the second pass the snow had come down, heavier than he liked, and a wagon that's bogging needs to be lighter, and 110 pounds of woman who couldn't drive, couldn't shoot, and couldn't pay him. Another dime was the easiest 110 pounds to lose. He hadn't even argued about it. He just looked back at her, over his shoulder, chewing, and said the team was tiring, and would she mind walking a spell to spare them, and she'd been climbing down to oblige him when his boot found her. Polite, almost. That was the part she'd turn over later in the bad hours. He'd asked her to step down like a gentleman, handing a lady out of a carriage, and then he'd kicked her into a snowbank and driven on. For a while she just sat there in it. The cold was honest, at least. It came up through the wet wool of her skirt and through the soles of her city boots. Thin-soled things, made for a dry brick sidewalk on Arch Street, stitched by a man who had certainly never imagined them standing in a foot of November snow at 6,000 feet. It came up through her and settled into the meat of her, and her teeth started in, before her mind had caught up to her circumstances. When her mind did catch up, it didn't help her any. She was alone. She knew that much. The pass behind her climbed up into a dirty grey sky, and the trail ahead of her dropped away into more trees than she had ever seen in her life. Dark spruce shouldered together, so close the spaces between them looked solid, looked like the inside of a thing rather than the outside. There was no town. There had been no town for 2 days. The last building she'd seen had been a stage stop, with a sod roof, where a woman with no teeth had sold her 3 biscuits and looked at her city coat with something that was either pity or appetite. Thea got up. Her knee had taken the worst of the fall, and it told her so. She stood in the ruts the wagon had left, and she did the only sensible thing, which was to follow them, because ruts led somewhere, and the snow led nowhere. And she put one ruined boot in front of the other, and started down the mountain in the failing light. She had been somebody 3 weeks ago. She made herself remember it as she walked, the way you press on a bruise to make sure it's still there. She had been Thea, who taught piano to the daughters of men who owned mills, who could read music, and a little Latin, and a great deal of the particular language of polite people, pretending not to notice that her father's name had gone bad. She had worn gloves with 11 buttons. She had once cried for an entire afternoon, because a man she'd been promised to married a girl with a better dowry, and she had thought at the time that this was the worst thing that could happen to a person. The debt had been the worst thing, the debt her father left when the fever took him, the debt that had teeth, the men who came to the house and stood too close and explained in soft voices what a young woman of her position might do to settle accounts. She had chosen the wilderness over those men. She'd sold the piano and the 11-button gloves, and bought passage to a cousin in Oregon she'd met exactly once. She had chosen this. She kept reminding herself she had chosen this, because the alternative was to admit that the choice had been made for her by people who'd known she had none. The light went out of the sky, the way water goes out of a cracked basin, all at once at the end. The cold doubled. She had read, in some magazine, in some warm parlor, that freezing was supposed to be peaceful at the last, that a person grew warm and sleepy and simply let go. It seemed to her stumbling down a mountain in the dark with her boot soles flapping loose. An obscene thing to have printed. There was nothing peaceful in it. Her body wanted to live with the stupid animal ferocity that had nothing to do with her piano or her Latin, and it drove her on past the point where her mind had quit, made her legs go when she'd stopped telling them to. She didn't hear the river until she was nearly in it. The ruts had bent toward the sound, and she'd followed them. And now there was black water moving fast over black stones a few feet from her boots. And the cold coming off it was a different kind, a wet, killing cold. And she stopped because some last scrap of sense told her that to fall in that water was to die in it. That was when the wolf coughed. It wasn't a wolf. She'd learned that, but in the dark, the sound, low, close, a wet rumble that came from something with a chest the size of a barrel, was every story she'd ever heard about what waited past the edge of the lamplight, and she went absolutely still, her heart slamming so hard she could feel it in her wrists, in her throat, in the cut on her chin. 2 eyes caught what little light there was and threw it back green. She did not scream. She would be proud of that, later, in the cabin, in the warm. She didn't scream and she didn't run, because running was a thing the animal part of her understood would get her killed, and so she stood in the snow by the killing water and waited to find out how it would go. The shape that came out of the trees was not the animal. She could see it. Now, a low-slung shadow slinking sideways, flinched away from the bigger shape, and the bigger shape was a man. He was enormous. That was her first and stupidest thought, the kind of thought you have when your mind has narrowed to the size of a keyhole. He stood ahead and more above her, and he was made wider than any man she knew. By the hides he wore, a long coat sewn together out of a dozen mismatched animals, the fur worn to leather in patches, and, over one shoulder, a rifle that he was not pointing at her, but was not pointing away from her either. He smelled of wood smoke and grease and something gamey underneath, and his beard had swallowed most of his face, and what showed of it above the beard was weathered to the color and texture of a saddle. He looked at her the way a man looks at a fence that's come down in the night. A problem, a chore, something that was now, inconveniently, his to deal with. "You're a long way from a road," he said. His voice was a low scrape, a voice that didn't get used much. "Coach put you off." "Freight wagon," she said, and was disgusted to hear how thin it came out, how it shook. She'd meant it to be even. She'd meant to sound like a woman who could not be kicked off the back of anything. He grunted. He looked past her at the river, and up the way she'd come, and back at her, and she could see him doing the same arithmetic Vance had done. The weight of her, the cost of her, except his sum came out different, and she didn't yet know why. "You'll be dead before light in them clothes," he said. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even unkind, exactly. It was a man reading the weather and reading her, and telling her the result. "Frost'll have your toes by midnight. Cat'll have the rest of you by morning." How comforting. Some old reflex of hers reached up out of the cold and put that on her tongue. The dry city tone she'd used on men who underestimated her in parlors, and it sounded ridiculous out here. A music box wound up in a snowfield, but she couldn't help it. It was the last thing she owned. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, in the beard. It might have been the beginning of a thing that, in a warmer man, would have grown into a smile. It died before it got there. He shrugged the rifle off his shoulder, and for one freezing instant she thought she had misjudged everything, but he only used the stock to point up the slope, away from the river, into the trees. "Cabins up the ridge," he said. "Got a stove, got a roof that holds." She looked where he pointed and saw nothing but more dark. "And what," she said, "do you want for it?" Because she knew. She'd lived in a city long enough. She'd been a young woman with no money for long enough to know that no man held a door open in the cold for the pleasure of it. There was always a price written somewhere on the underside of the kindness, and she'd learned to find it fast before she walked through. He didn't pretend otherwise. She'd come over the winter to be grateful for that, though she couldn't have said so then. "Work," he said. "I got an elk hung in the smokehouse going to spoil because I can't be two places. I got traps need running. I got a fire that goes out when I'm up on the trap line 2 days at a stretch, and a fire that goes out in February is a man froze to death by March. I've been doing it all by myself, and a man who does it all by himself makes a mistake eventually, and a mistake out here is the kind you don't get to learn from." He shifted his weight. The snow squeaked under his boots. "I don't need company," he said. "I need a pair of hands that'll keep working when I'm not standing over them. You give me that till the thaw. I'll keep you alive till the thaw. After that, the trail's open and you can walk to Black Pine and catch the stage and never think of me again." He paused. "That's the whole of it. I won't lay a finger on you. You'll have the bed by the wall and I'll have the floor by the stove. Same as I had before you came. But you'll earn the roof. Nobody up here eats who don't work." A wife in everything but the part the word usually meant, an arrangement, a contract written in cold breath between a desperate woman and a man who'd decided she was a tool he could use before the snow ruined her. She should have been insulted. The Thea of 3 weeks ago would have been. The Thea standing by the Black River with her boots coming apart did the only arithmetic that mattered now, the same arithmetic he'd done, the weight of staying against the weight of walking, and found that she wanted to live more than she wanted to be insulted. "I don't know how to do any of those things," she said. "I'll show you the once," he said. "After that you'll know, and if I'm slow, then you'll be slow and learn anyway, because the slow ones learn fastest up here." He was already turning. He didn't wait to see if she'd follow. That too she'd come to understand. He was not a man who begged or coaxed or sweetened a thing. He laid it down flat and let you pick it up or leave it lying. "There's a blanket in my pack. Wrap up. So we got an hour's climb, and you'll want to sweat into it, not freeze in it." The blanket smelled of dog and tallow and him. She wrapped it around her shoulders like the finest thing she'd ever worn, and she followed the wide, dark shape of him up into the trees, and she didn't ask his name until they were nearly to the top, when her legs were past pain and into a kind of distant ringing. "Silas," he said, without turning around. He didn't ask hers. She told him anyway, into the back of his coat, and he didn't answer, and she thought he hadn't heard. But a long while after, when she'd stopped expecting it, he said it once quietly, testing it. "Thea." Then nothing more. The climb took everything she had, and a measure she didn't know she'd been keeping in reserve. The man walked through the timber the way she might have crossed a ballroom, easy and certain, and she crashed along behind him, snapping branches and going down on her hands in the snow, and every time she fell he stopped and waited, 10 paces on, a patient shadow, and never once put out a hand. She hated him for it. She built the hatred carefully, log by log, because the heat of it was the only heat she had. She thought about his smell and his silence and the insult of his bargain, and she used all of it to keep her feet moving, and somewhere in the using of it, she stopped. Being a woman who fainted over broken engagements, and became, without noticing the moment it happened, a woman who climbed a mountain because the only other choice was to lie down in the snow and quit. The cabin, when the trees finally let it through, was not a cabin in any sense she'd have used the word before. It was a low, dark hump of logs and sod, one shuttered window, a door of split planks, built squat against the weather like an animal hunkered down. But smoke meant a stove, and a stove meant heat. And when he shouldered the door open and lit the lamp, and the yellow light fell across the packed dirt floor, and the iron stove and the wall of pelts, and the small hard bed built into the corner, she could have wept at the ugliness of it, because the ugliness was warm. "Shut the door," he said, already on his knees at the stove. "You're spending heat I cut wood for." She shut the door. That was the first night. There were 100 and some after it, and she lived everyone, and the living of them changed her into someone the men on Arch Street would not have recognized and would not have wanted to. He taught her the elk first, because the elk was spoiling. He took her out to the smokehouse in the grey of the next morning and showed her the great carcass hanging from a beam, and put a knife in her hand, a wicked thing, honed thin, and he stood behind her and guided her wrist through the first long cut, and her stomach turned over and she gagged, and he didn't laugh at her and didn't comfort her either, just said, "Breathe. Through your mouth till it passes," and waited, and it passed, and she made the next cut on her own. By the end of the week her hands knew the work her mind still flinched from. By the end of the month she could break down a quarter without him in the smokehouse at all, and she found, to her private astonishment, that there was a satisfaction in it, a cold, clean competence, that she had never once felt playing a sonata correctly for a roomful of people who weren't listening. She learned the traps. She learned to walk the line he'd cut through the timber and reset the iron jaws and carry back what they'd caught, marten and fox and the big snowshoe hares, and to skin them at the table by lamplight with her tongue between her teeth. She learned which wood burned hot and fast and which burned slow and long, and to bank the stove at night so a bed of coals would be waiting in the black cold of morning. She learned to read the sky the way he did, the particular dirty yellow that meant snow, the high thin scratch of cloud that meant a clear cold snap was coming and the trapline would freeze. And she learned, because no one had ever told her, and she'd never had cause to wonder exactly how much of a life out here was the simple grinding war against filth. That was the part nobody in any warm parlor ever thought about. You thought about the bears and the blizzards. You didn't think about the fact that there was no bath, that the river was a wall of killing cold, and to wash in it was to court death, and that for weeks at a stretch a body simply went unwashed, hair to grease and skin to grime, until you stopped smelling yourself because there was no clean to measure the dirty against. The first weeks she'd lain awake, itching, half mad with it, dreaming of the deep tin tub in the house on Arch Street and the maid carrying up kettle after kettle of steaming water. It was Thea who fixed it, and the fixing of it was the first time she understood that the cabin was becoming, in some sideways way, hers. She set the big kettle and the 2 pots going on the stove and on the coals beside it, all at once, every vessel they owned, and she heated water until the one window ran with steam, and she dragged the wooden wash trough in from the lean-to and lined it with a hide, and she poured and poured until there was 8 inches of water hot enough to redden the skin, and she shut the door and barred it, and the smell of the wet pine of the trough came up with the steam, and she lowered herself into it, inch by inch, with a sound she was glad no one was there to hear. She wept a little in the hot water, not from sorrow, from the sheer animal mercy of being warm and clean for the first time in a month, from how much it turned out a body could be flattened down by small daily indignities. You didn't even have the words to complain about, the cold and the grime and the cracked hands, and how a few pots of hot water could lift the whole weight of it for an hour and give a person back to herself. When Silas came down off the trapline that night and found the trough by the stove and the water gone grey and Thea with her hair washed and drying loose around her face, he'd only ever seen smudged. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her for a moment too long, and something crossed his weathered face and was gone, and he said only, "Smart. Heat the rocks in the fire next time and drop 'em in. Keeps it hot longer." And then he hung up his rifle, and that was all. But after that, there was always wash water heating Sunday nights, his and hers, and he never said it was good, and she never asked him to, and it became a thing they did, a small kept ritual in the wild, and it was the first warm thing between them that wasn't strictly a matter of staying alive. He was not a cruel man. She'd thought him cruel, that first night, for the hand he never offered on the climb. She came to understand it differently. He'd let her find her own feet because he'd known, with a knowledge she didn't have yet, that a woman who'd be carried up that mountain would be a woman he'd be carrying all winter, and that the kindest thing he could do for her was to make her carry herself. The day she came in from the line with her first fox, and threw it on the table and said, flat, that the trap had near taken her thumb off, and she'd reset it anyway. He looked at her over his coffee for a long moment, and then he did smile the whole way, and it changed his face entirely, and she felt the smile land somewhere behind her ribs, and was annoyed at herself for the rest of the day. The blizzard came in February, and it nearly took them both. It came faster than even he had read it. He was up on the high line when the sky closed, and Thea, banking the stove against the cold, looked up to find the one window gone white and the wind picking up a note she hadn't heard before, a high, steady scream that didn't gust and didn't quit. She knew enough by then to be afraid. She also knew enough to know that Silas was 2 miles up a mountain in it, and that 2 miles in a whiteout was a distance men died inside of all the time, walking in circles 100 yards from their own door. She did not sit by the warm stove and wait. She would think about that after, with a kind of awe at herself. The old Thea would have waited, helpless and weeping, for a man to either come or not come. This one took the coil of rope from the wall and tied one end to the iron ring beside the door and the other around her own waist. And she lit the big lantern, and she went out into the screaming white, with the rope paying out behind her, into a cold that hit like a wall, and she stood at the edge of the clearing where the trail came down, and she swung the lantern in slow arcs, and she screamed his name into the wind until her voice tore. He'd been off the trail. He told her, after that he'd lost it a 1/4 mile up, that he'd been walking by feel and the slope of the ground and the wind on his left cheek, and that he'd known, with the flat certainty he knew weather, that he was a dead man, that he had maybe 20 minutes before his legs quit, and then through the white there'd been a smear of yellow light, swinging, and a sound under the wind that might have been his name in a torn voice, and he'd turned toward it the way a man turns toward the last thing. He came out of the storm half frozen and fell against her, and they hauled themselves hand over hand back down the rope to the door, and she got him inside and barred the storm out and stripped the frozen coat off him and put him by the stove and packed the wash trough with snowmelt warmed lukewarm. Never hot. Hot would kill a frozen man. He'd taught her that himself, some idle evening, never guessing. And she worked his white dead fingers and his grey feet until the blood came screaming back into them, and he groaned with the agony of being alive. And outside the storm went on for 2 more days. In those 2 days, snowed into one small room with the man whose life she'd pulled out of the white, something turned over between them and stayed turned. It wasn't spoken. They weren't speaking sorts, either of them, and the things that had passed between them were too large and too plain for the kind of words people used. But on the second night, with the wind still going, and the lamp turned low to save oil, he reached across the small space between the bed and the floor where he lay, and he took her hand, her ruined, hardened, capable hand, with the white scar across the thumb where the fox trap had caught her, and he held it and ran his rough thumb once across her knuckles, and neither of them said a word, and she didn't take her hand back, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. After that, he had the floor by the stove on the cold nights, and the bed by the wall on the colder ones, and the arrangement between them changed its nature, without either of them ever once renegotiating its terms, out loud. The thaw came in April, the way it does in the high country, all at once and full of noise, the river loud again, and the snow going off the south slopes in grey sheets, and the mud everywhere. And with the thaw, the trail to Black Pine opened, and one bright dripping afternoon a man came up it on a mule. Thea was at the trestle table behind the cabin when she heard the mule scraping the last of the winter fat off a beaver pelt, her sleeve shoved up and her forearms speckled and her hair tied back out of the way with a strip of leather. She didn't stop scraping. She'd learned that too, that a pelt left half-scraped in the sun was a pelt ruined. The man was named Cruz. He came up trading, hides for coffee and flour and lead, and he'd known Silas a few years the way men out there knew each other, by name and by reputation and not much else. He climbed down off the mule, and he looked at the cabin and the smokehouse, and the stretched hides, and the table, and she watched something work across his face. Watched him take in the cracked hands, and the leather tie, in her hair, and the blade, and the blood, and then take in the line of her, the city bones still under all of it, and arrive at the wrong conclusion, and pity her for it. "Ma'am," he said, "careful, the way you'd talk to a dog you weren't sure of. You all right up here?" "I'm finishing a pelt," she said. He glanced at Silas, who had come around the corner of the cabin with the rifle in the crook of his arm and his face gone to the old flat stone she remembered from the first night. He glanced back at Thea. He lowered his voice as though Silas wouldn't hear it, 12 feet away in dead air. "I'm going back down to Black Pine in the morning," Cruz said. "Stage runs Thursday. You can be in Denver inside a week. I got room on the mule, and I'd take it as no trouble." "No charge, ma'am, none at all, to see a lady out of a place like this and back to where there's, hot water, beds, other women, hot water." He said it like a kindness, like a key held out to a cage, and Thea felt the strangest thing rise up in her, and it took her a moment to recognize it as fury. Not at Cruz. Cruz was a decent enough man, saying a decent enough thing. The fury was at the man she'd been, the one who'd needed saving, the one a stranger could look at and see only a victim wanting rescue. She thought about the bath she'd built herself out of nothing but pots and hide and will. She thought about the rope around her waist and the lantern swinging in the white. She thought about the fox and the thumb and the elk and the long climb she'd made on her own 2 feet, because a hard, quiet man had loved her enough, in his way, before either of them had a word for it, to refuse to carry her. She looked over Cruz's shoulder at Silas. He was standing very still. He wasn't going to ask her to stay. She knew that the way she knew weather now. He'd made a bargain in the cold, and the bargain had a term. And the term was the thaw, and the thaw had come, and he was a man who kept the letter of a thing, because the letter was all he trusted himself to say. His face was stone, and his eyes were on the muddy ground between his boots, and he was already, she could see it, taking his weight back onto his heels, getting ready to nod, getting ready to let her go, because he believed that letting her go was the price of having been honest about the terms. "You can put the lead and the coffee in the cold cellar," Thea said. She said it to Cruz. She said it loud and level, the old parlor clarity coming up through the new rough voice, and it cut across, the dripping clearing clean as the first hard frost. Cruz stopped. "Ma'am, the lead and the coffee Silas is trading you for, put them down in the cold cellar by the smokehouse, not here by the door. The damp by the door'll spoil the coffee, and I won't have my flour and my lead sweating all spring because a man set them down in the easy spot." She looked back at the pelt and took up the scraper again. "And mind the mule by the salting table. I don't want it tracking through my fat." For a long moment the only sound was the river and the drip of the snow melt off the eaves. Cruz looked at her, and then he looked at Silas, and a slow understanding crossed his face. And he shook his head once, and muttered something about there being no figuring some folks, and he turned to untie the sacks off his mule. Thea didn't watch him do it. She'd turned her back on the trail, down the mountain, on the stage and the beds, and the other women, and the hot water somebody else heated, and she scraped the pelt, and the small frantic hammering of her own heart was the only thing that gave her away. When she finally looked up, Silas had crossed the clearing and was standing over her, the rifle still in his arm, and his stone face had cracked clean down the middle, and underneath it was something raw and unguarded she'd only glimpsed twice all winter. He didn't know what to do with his face. He'd had no practice at it. "You didn't shoot anything today," she said, because it was easier than the other thing, and because it was true, and because the work was the language they'd built between them, and she trusted it more than words. "No," he said, His scraped-down voice had gone lower still, gone quiet. "Reckon I'll go check the high traps then. Before dark." "I'll come," she said. He reached out, slow, the way he did everything, and laid his rough hand against the side of her face. Just for a moment. His thumb in the grime and the cold off the pelt. And she leaned the small weight of her head into it, and the mule brayed and Cruz swore at it, and the river ran loud, with all the winter melting off the mountain at once. They walked up into the trees together, the two of them in the loud, bright thaw, to check the high traps before the dark came down. Behind them, the snow gave up the last of itself in the sun, and ahead of them the line ran on into the timber, and there was a whole green season coming that neither of them had thought, last November, they'd live to see.